Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes to allow people to join in. Thank you all so much for taking some time and coming in on this webinar. We're really excited to have all of you here. So we'll just give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started. So in the chat box, if you could let us know where you're joining from, that would be amazing. So welcome everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Our webinar today is Housing Solutions for Male Survivors of Trafficking. This webinar is brought to you by Freedom Network USA. Freedom Network USA is the nation's largest alliance of anti-trafficking providers advancing a rights-based approach to trafficking in the United States. My name is Avantika Shenoy. I'm the Training Institute Coordinator at Freedom Network USA, and I'm really excited that you all are here today. So in this webinar, I'm seeing a lot of responses on the chat box that there are folks coming in from all over the country, and it's so exciting. It's so exciting that you all are here. And I want to acknowledge that there is a lot of expertise in this webinar through all of you joining in from different parts of the country, as well as through our panelists. However, for today's webinar, everyone is on listen-only mode, but there are multiple ways for you to interact with the panelists as well as each other. So first of all, to make sure that your audio is working, at the top left corner of the screen, there is a speaker button, and you're going to have to click that. So if it's green, that means that your audio is working. And then the second feature right next to it is like a man with his hand up, and that's the raised hand feature. So this is something that we utilize to get some really quick feedback from all of you. So if everyone just wants to go and try that feature out, go ahead and click on the raised hand feature right now. Awesome. I see so many people have raised your hands. And now just to lower your hand, you'll just have to click the same feature and it'll lower your hand. Perfect. So these are a couple tools, and then of course people have been already familiarized with the chat box. The chat box is where you can jump in, give some of your thoughts, and share some feedback. So, as I mentioned, this webinar is brought to you by Freedom Network USA through the Freedom Network Training and Technical Training Institute. The Freedom Network Training Institute is the training and technical assistance arm of Freedom Network USA. And through the Institute, we have the Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project. This project provides advocates dynamic as well as up-to-date training and technical assistance around housing for survivors of trafficking. And we do this through bi-monthly webinars like this one, and we have multiple webinars that we are also conducting and have recorded for you all to participate in or view. So I'm actually putting in a couple links in the chat box right now, and that is to our housing page as well as the resource library. So, go ahead and check those resources out whenever you feel like it. Then we also provide individual technical assistance to OVC grantees. So that is the Training Institute as well as the Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project. Then today's webinar, I'm really excited to introduce you to our moderator. For the rest of the webinar, Maya Hasek, the Anti-Trafficking Program Director from Tapestry, will be taking you through the webinar, and she's got a great wealth of expertise in the field as well as in the topic, and she will be kind of guiding you through the rest of the webinar and engaging with all of you folks. So I'm going to hand it over to Maya.
Thank you so much, Avantika. Like Avantika said, my name is Maya Hasek. I'm the Anti-Human Trafficking Program Director at Tapestry. We're a nonprofit social service agency working out of Atlanta, Georgia, and covering most of the state of Georgia. So some of the metro area as well as some of the very rural areas. Very familiar with working with both survivors of labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking, male and female. But I'm actually excited to introduce today's speakers. We will be getting a lot of expertise from them about what worked and what did not work, specifically talking about housing. Before we get started, before I introduce our speakers, I just want to mention that if you do have a question during the webinar, please type it up in the chat box and I will keep an eye on it. We will answer all questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll also ask you to complete a survey to let us know how we did today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. We have Rafael Bautista, and he is an expert consultant with Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center, as well as National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. Rafael's experience and expertise has helped different organizations across the United States in creating trafficking programs, strategies, outreach material, videos, in regards to human trafficking awareness. Next, we have Solange Cheng, who is a Director of Victim Services at Mosaic Family Services, a safe haven for survivors of human trafficking and family violence. She regularly provides outreach, education, and technical assistance regarding human trafficking, family violence, trauma-informed care, cultural competency, and other related best practices. So thank you both for joining us today and allowing us to hear your expertise in regards to housing. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the goals of today's webinar. If I could have the next slide, please. So the goals of today's webinar are to equip anti-trafficking providers with an understanding of the challenges that we face when working with male survivors, not only when it comes to providing housing or accessing housing, but other services as well. Then we're going to have our speakers talk about some practical ideas for serving male survivors. And then we're going to discuss some existing models for housing of males, specifically victims of human trafficking. So if I can have the next slide. So yes, I'm going to go ahead and frame it and talk about some of the challenges. But before we go into that, I wanted to introduce a quote that we pulled out of the Trafficking in Persons report of 2017. Oftentimes we think, we are the only ones that are dealing with lack of resources. We're having issues within our states as far as accessing different resources for different survivors. But looking at this quote, it really shows us that we're not alone. Globally, we are all behind in our response to working with male survivors. Some organizations across the United States have, developed some practices that could be replicated and utilized, in the rest of the states. So I'm happy to say that some of those individuals are going to be on this webinar today and are going to talk about what they have done within their communities to create additional resources for male survivors of trafficking. But just very quickly, the most frequently cited global statistic on human trafficking indicates that men and boys represent nearly half of the total number of trafficking survivors. Yet the identification and proper care of male victims remains an enormous challenge to governments and care providers around the world. So we're not the only ones dealing with this challenge of lack of resources. If I could have the next slide, please. So to kind of pinpoint some of the challenges specific to housing that we have heard across different states and from different service providers, it would be that many of the housing programs across the United States that cater specifically to survivors of human trafficking do so specifically for victims of sex trafficking and specifically for females. In a way, alienating services for male survivors that could be survivors of either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. We're also seeing challenges with service providers accessing homeless shelters for emergency housing of sometimes even female survivors. Although this could be, a potential solution for very short term, for a 1-day stay, even 2-day stay, it is not a long-term solution for the population that we are working with. Most homeless shelters operate on the premise that first come, first serve, and it is looked at as a day shelter. So even the space in a homeless shelter is not guaranteed. There's not much privacy, and there has been research conducted that indicates that some of the homeless shelters are actually places where individuals are recruited for human trafficking, both for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Additional challenges include transitional housing, which caters to individuals who experience domestic violence, sex trafficking, and sexual assault. Alienating individuals whose experience fits more closely with labor trafficking. And that is both for males and females. I'm not sure if you see it or if you have had an opportunity to check out our resource library, but there's information about different type of funding opportunities for housing as it relates to victims of human trafficking. Once you've had a chance to take a deeper look into that, you'll see that not all housing opportunities, specifically for transitional housing, address the needs of survivors of labor trafficking. So our speakers are going to elaborate on that as well. Then another challenge that we're often seeing is immigration status and the inability to gain transitional housing or long-term housing without having proper documentation. And sometimes, if you work with foreign nationals, it might not be only, a legal status in the United States, but even, the ability to produce a passport with that would have a picture identification of the client that you are serving. So at times you might be dealing with individuals who really don't have any type of picture ID, and the passport within their specific consulate could take months or even years at a time. So we're going to give you some background on, what you can do in those cases. The next, one of the challenges is, survivors may be penalized for crimes associated with their trafficking. An example of that would be if an individual has a criminal record, and that could be a criminal record as a result of, forced prostitution. That could be a criminal record as it relates to having to perform some type of illegal activity as it relates to their trafficking incidents. So if you're looking at transitional housing, or if you're looking at different apartment complexes, that could really pose a problem for the clients that you're serving. Additionally, I have heard different survivors in the past talk about because they themselves were sexually victimized as children, the system in which they were in thought that they could turn out to be perpetrators, therefore really, reducing the resources that they had to offer these individuals. And then we also have the challenge of stigma and shame associated with trafficking, of individuals coming forward, especially males, to talk about their victimization, and to be in a vulnerable space to accept the services of victim service providers. And lastly, one of the challenges with accessing housing for male survivors is lack of adequate housing can lead to long-term instability. And I'm actually going to leave it at that, because Rafael is going to give us a real live example of an individual where that turned out to be the case. If I can have the next slide. And before I turn it over to the panelists, I wanted to quickly go over some of the harmful practices when working with male survivors. That is making assumptions about clients' goals and needs, and that is just a part of, client-centered, victim-centered approach where, we work with survivors as experts of resources, and they are experts of their needs and their goals. So having a space where we allow the survivor to tell us what their goals are and what their needs are, even if we may think otherwise. Additional harmful practices that we have noticed is advising survivors to live in transitional housing or emergency housing with restrictions, even after they tell us that they're not interested or don't feel comfortable in that. With being housed in those places. And that includes shelters or even transitional housing places where there is a curfew, use of phone is restricted, and there is a requirement of participation in, let's say, religious activities or other activities that the survivor might not be comfortable with. Then we also have finding housing in high-risk areas. And if we are utilizing homeless shelters, then there is, a higher possibility, like I mentioned earlier, that these shelters are located in areas kind of known for recruiting individuals into human trafficking. Another harmful practice is advising survivors to utilize housing that is not sustainable after the program is no longer able to financially assist. So locating housing, where the client is not going to be able to pay for their rent and utilities once you're no longer able to assist financially. And then lastly, not respecting the survivor's wishes. And that plays a part into that, victim-centered approach where we are working as partners with the survivors that we serve. So now that we know what some of the challenges are, as well as some of the harmful practices overall when working with male survivors of human trafficking, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rafael to tell us the real-life impact of that the housing can have on male survivors.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Maya. Thank you for framing the webinar for everybody and talking a little bit more about the challenges. Unfortunately, these slides are really important, and we really wanted Rafael to be here and to talk you through these slides. Unfortunately, we're having some technical issues, and we're still working on troubleshooting. So we will be moving on to Sulan's slides, and Sulan will be talking a little bit about housing opportunities as well as promising practices. And hopefully we can try and have Rafael come in later and kind of close it all up together and talk a little bit more about the real impacts. So Sulan, we'll have you come up.
Okay, great. Thank you again to everyone for being here today. And I just wanted to give a little bit more background about myself and our Mosaic Family Services, which is the organization that I work for, so that you kind of understand where we're coming from in some of these recommendations and information, and also to acknowledge that I know that each of your organizations are going to be different or coming from a different place. Mosaic Family Services, we have been a nonprofit for 25 years that is a safe haven for survivors of human rights abuses, including, human trafficking, family violence, sexual assault, and refugees. And we also have a staff that, what makes us kind of unique is that we have a staff that speaks over 27 languages, and we're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, so we recognize that means that we are obviously, a large population, large cities. We have multiple cities that are within close range, and we have probably access to more resources than most individuals, especially those who are in rural or suburban or smaller population areas. And we actually started working with our organization working with refugees, which led us to working with foreign nationals and family violence. And then in 2001, we started working with human trafficking. And initially, we served all foreign nationals, but now, because of various reasons, including our funding, we now serve all survivors, including U.S. citizens and including males and females, adults and minors. And we provide comprehensive services, including case management, a lot of different housing options, legal counseling, economic empowerment. So that's kind of the background of where the information I'm presenting is coming from. Next slide, please. As it was previously mentioned, obviously the Maya mentioned housing is particularly challenging, especially for male survivors. Therefore, I just kind of wanted to talk through some of the opportunities that might exist and really highlight the idea of looking at the intersectionalities of human trafficking with other areas such as family violence, homelessness, disability, and refugee. It's really important. I want to emphasize the importance of kind of thinking outside of the box. I think typically in our organizations, we could get very siloed into only focusing on, trafficking specific resources or trafficking programs. And a lot of times we might be forgetting about or not thinking about how these different intersectionalities or areas that our survivors are experiencing may also actually allow them to benefit other resources or other opportunities. And I think with, male survivors in particular that we have worked with, we really see the intersection of homelessness, disability, mental health, and substance abuse. But I would not automatically rule out or assume that there isn't domestic violence or sexual assault, since they could have been living in the same place as their trafficker, or their romantic partner is their trafficker. And I think this is really from Mosaic where we have ultimately benefited the most. I apologize, give me 1 second. Where we benefit the most because our staff is really trained to serve multiple victimizations and other populations, so therefore they're really familiar with resources and options for all of the different areas that are on the slide. I like to think of it as our staff has kind of built this extensive toolbox, and they can kind of pull out the right tool or resource. So for example, if there is no trafficking shelters that are accepting men or no trafficking shelters, they will have already done screening or assessed domestic violence to potentially get them into a domestic violence shelter. And again, I recognize in Dallas, we're fortunate enough to have domestic violence shelters that actually do accept males or have male-specific domestic violence shelters. So, as some of the different opportunities include, federal funding, such as through HUD, the Office of Violence Against Women, Victims of Crime Act. Also, HHS has funding available to serve both domestic and foreign nationals. That includes some financial assistance towards housing. There's also looking at each of your individual states, looking at, I can only speak specifically to Texas because that's where we're at, but in Texas we have crime victims compensation that covers rent and relocation assistance, that includes trafficking survivors. We also have funding that's through our Department of Housing and Community Affairs in Texas and our local Texas Health and Human Services. And then looking even smaller at the local funding level on the city side, landscape, such as your local continuum of care or city housing grants or foundations and other private entities. And then just kind of looking through faith-based institutions, organizations, partnering with community-based housing programs. You know, a lot of our male survivors come from diverse cultural immigrant backgrounds, so we often do try to partner with community programs that specifically serve those populations, or even use our contacts within the communities that within immigrant population communities, like leaders or churches or different other community-based programs. And then, you know, if absolutely needed, we really do look at, is there a better program that can provide the housing need somewhere else outside of our area, if it means that maybe they need to be relocated in order to access safe housing. And it's not listed on this list, but I wanted to make sure to mention that oftentimes the male survivors we work with are really tied to labor trafficking. And so there's obviously intersectionality and opportunity for partnerships and opportunities with maybe migrant or labor or job training organizations who may also have resources for housing for survivors. And since, you know, the housing for male survivors is so limited, honestly, I think sometimes the only way you might be able to access housing or be able to get housing is to either find a way to provide it through your own organization, or you know, help other organizations in the area apply for funding. And I just wanted to point out that on the right side of the screen, there is a pod that includes a PDF with links to different funding opportunities from HUD, from OBW, from OBC, from victims of crime. And we kind of included past solicitations and notices so that you can get a feel for what those funding opportunities look like and what's required when you're trying to apply for that funding, or trying to collaborate with other organizations to apply for that funding. And then the only last thing I want to just say is please be aware that some of the federal funding may be allocated through the state or city government agency, which means that the granting agency or the process might look a little different state by state. Okay, next slide. The other, you know, as you're engaging with community resources and partners to place male survivors, more often than not, most of them, if not all of them, are receiving some form of government funding. Therefore, just wanted to point out that those organizations or those housing programs are subject to non-discrimination laws and policies set by the government, which includes non-discrimination based on gender and gender identity, even if they're only partially funded by that particular government grant. So a lot of times, you know, all of the wording and the requirements for each particular grant requirement or policy might differ, but most of the time they obviously emphasize providing like comparable services for victims. And when we talk about even if the program is segregated by like sex or gender identity, and when we say comparable, we're really talking about, we're not necessarily talking about identical services, but we are talking about similar, you know, benefits, quality, safety, amenities, and services. And so to kind of give you an example of that, at Mosaic, we have an emergency shelter, but it is designated for women and their children. And so when we get a male survivor, what we have done is basically to provide comparable services, we make sure to, typically we will place them in something like a hotel setting, but we make sure that the hotel setting is in a safe place, that it has, you know, security cameras, that there is staff on site. We make sure that when we place someone in a hotel, it's not just for 1 day or 2 days or a week. We actually build in our budget to be able to place someone in a hotel for a month or 2 months or 3 months, or longer, depending. And we make sure that, you know, from the get-go, we're providing all of the essential items that they need, whether it's food, clothing, toiletries. And we pick hotels that have kitchens so that they can prepare food in it, because that's how it is at our shelter. And then we make sure that the case managers do, you know, meet with the survivors on a very regular basis, and does provide them support and transportation to our main outreach office to access all of the same services that someone in our shelter would receive, such as counseling, legal, economic empowerment, classes, all of the medical, dental, all of those things. And I have to be honest, this is not as good of as an option as having just a male-specific shelter or co-ed program, but it is the best way we found to meet these requirements within our limited funding and staff capacity. And since many of our male survivors have limited English proficiency, I just kind of wanted to mention that, again, within those government funding requirements, there's also requirements to provide meaningful, comparable services and access for male survivors who have limited English proficiency. And that can include looking like having language access plan, having trained and paid interpreters and translators for every single interaction, appointment, call, or meeting. And, I know that when you're really tight on a budget or when you're in a pinch, it can be really easy to, turn over to Google Translate or try to use a child. But those options really do not provide meaningful access where they are receiving the same benefits and the same access to services and effectively communicating. And so I think the last thing I just wanted to mention on this slide is that if you are coming across difficulties with getting your male survivor into another program that should be following these government funding requirements, it is really important that you do try to do some effective advocacy. And I like to emphasize effective because I know that it can be very easy to get mad and frustrated and kind of just want to throw these policies in people's faces and demand that they, provide services or accept your male survivor. But you want to make sure that when you advocate, you're also not burning bridges and that you're leaving the door for future collaboration and opportunities for training and education. And so, definitely make sure that you try to build these relationships and have these conversations before you're actually in the moment trying to get a male survivor into the shelter. It could also be really helpful to make sure you're talking to the right person, because oftentimes the people that are telling you no are not the decision makers and are not able to make decisions or change things. And then, obviously when it's needed, you can always contact, their funders. You can contact the local continuum of care. You can contact DOJ's Civil Rights Division if you're really getting nowhere. I think that the other thing I wanted to mention about these government funding requirements is that there is a PDF on the file pod that will show that will have a list of links to the different policies that are in the different policies that are within different government grants, and that includes the civil rights requirement from the Office of Justice, HUD's equal access funding rule to address gender identity and the LGBTQ population, and then VAWA, which covers most domestic violence shelter programs. Okay, next slide. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this slide because, there are fact sheets and recorded webinars on the Freedom Network's Housing Project website. But I just wanted to kind of point out that these are a variety of different categories of housing partnerships and options that might be available or we recommend looking into to kind of build your toolbox of options for your survivors. The categories that are in bold, such as the continuing care, the homeless shelters, hotels, motels, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing programs, those are typically programs that we have found to be the most easily accommodating or easily accessible to male survivors. And for us, like I said, we typically use, especially for emergency shelter or emergency housing need, we will really lean upon the idea of hotels, motels, and extended stay. And a lot of our survivors, male survivors, are labor trafficking, so they don't necessarily have the same triggers or concerns about staying in a hotel as we see with our sex trafficking survivors. And I wanted to mention under the Safe Shelter Collaborative, that is a organization that has developed they have a Safe Night app where it's a phone app where a donor base can donate money to pay for hotel nights for organizations, as well as they have a website that links service providers to shelters to kind of find available beds. So that could be a potential resource, but I did want to mention that is only available in a few states. So I know Texas, California, Colorado, New York, some of the other states. So you can go to I believe Avantika is going to be adding a link so that you can access their website and where they are currently operating. And also I wanted to mention that Restore NYC in New York actually has a relationship with hotel chains through the Safe Shelter Collaborative. So if you want more information about that, please reach out to the Freedom Network Training Institute Housing Project. I think as you're developing these housing partnerships and options, it's really, really important to think about, to emphasize like training and awareness about human trafficking and working with your partners about screening and identifying and referring trafficking survivors, including like doing warm referrals. So especially because with the male survivor population, they're going to, when they try to reach out to other housing programs, they're going to face challenges. They're going to face rejection and denial. It is highly recommended to do like warm referrals. So don't just give the survivors a list of, housing programs and phone numbers. You definitely want to make that first call with them to make sure that the resource is actually available and that your survivor is actually eligible, and setting up that first appointment, and then even providing transportation and accompanying them to that first appointment just to make sure that the connection is made. And the last thing on the list is host families. Out of everything on that list, it's pretty much the only one that we do not do at Mosaic, so I can't speak too much about it, but we are aware of other organizations that have used the idea, the model of host families, and typically it's associated with minors or especially minor females. But it is just an option when we're talking about thinking out of the box, taking something that's been working in one area and kind of trying to see if it makes sense for your program or any of your community partners. The idea where you would have community members who are appropriately vetted and trained and to accept, your survivors and house them for a period of time, whether that's a short-term period or a longer-term period. And obviously, one of the biggest things you'll need to think about with this option is making sure that there is safety planning all around for the survivor, for the host families. So just thinking through safety planning and risks. And again, all of that comes with the appropriate vetting and training of the host families. Okay, next slide. So I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about like housing placement considerations. Unfortunately, due to time, we're not going to be able to go through this whole list. So I definitely want to say that again, just like with many other things, there's a fact sheet and there's fact sheets and recorded webinars on housing assessment through the Freedom Network Freedom Institute's Housing Project website. So I would definitely refer everybody to go there. But the main thing I'll say about assessment is that it is really important to take a holistic approach in consideration of your male survivors' experiences, such as, all the trauma they experience, the abuse, the victimizations, even their support systems, their skills and their strengths, even if it may seem initially that's limited or non-existent. And, the diversion piece is a piece that is really, I've seen more in the homeless population or the homeless shelters or homeless organizations, where they're really trying to screen potential, individuals who need shelter, and they're trying to determine if there's a way to kind of divert them from the shelter while still providing, services to them, such as like, staying where they're at or living with a family member or friend. But that really, a lot of times that doesn't apply to our male survivor population. However, it's something just that shouldn't be completely discounted, because sometimes our survivors do have access to a family member or friend, or if they take some time to think about it, they might be able to identify a safe place for them to stay if there is no immediate shelter or housing available. And I often think the key to having a good assessment is really asking the right questions in the right way. So, for example, asking a survivor, do you have anyone you can stay with, might elicit a, no answer, because it's a yes or no answer. It's very easy, quick. They don't have to think about it, versus asking them, where was the last time you felt safe? Who were you staying with at that time? Who do you go to when you need help? So kind of, phrasing the question the right way so that they're actually thinking through options. And again, also while recognizing that they have very limited limited options, and the nature of trafficking keeps them pretty isolated. And the other thing to take in consideration when you're trying to place a survivor or help them, determine what is the best placement for themselves is just really identifying where their different needs are. Like, some of your survivors might be emergency, or they might be not needing emergency, they just need something more transitional or long-term. So kind of thinking through where they're at in their housing need. And then I just kind of wanted to touch upon gender identity and LGBTQ, especially with transgender males who are needing housing for shelters. And just wanted to, again, clarify that, under HUD funding, shelters, they can't have different rooms or conditions set for transgender males or females. And I have to be honest, at our shelter, we don't, I guess at our shelter, we don't accept transgender males, but I think the same thought applies where when we really started designing and making sure that we were being welcoming and inclusive of transgender females, I'll be honest, we made a mistake. We kind of assumed they needed their own room, they needed their own isolated bathroom. We kind of assumed that they wanted or preferred their own individual space. So I think that the key is to really not make any assumptions and to try to be as flexible and as accommodating as possible. You don't want to completely eliminate the option for if they just because they face additional barriers. We do try to assess and gauge whether they feel comfortable sharing a space, whether they feel more comfortable not sharing a space or a bathroom, and trying to accommodate to those different needs. And then I think the last piece about talking about the gender identity piece, whether, again, you're providing the housing service or you're advocating for your client, is really emphasizing the non-discrimination in the intakes for the other individuals that are staying in the housing area. We learned that, we had to do some education with other survivors. We had to reemphasize non-discrimination, and we, because, at our shelter or in our housing placements, we had people who had concerns about, living with somebody who identified, who was a transgender female or transgender male. So we just kind of had to do a lot of education with our population, and then while making sure not to single out any individual person as the cause for the education. So we try to preemptively do that when they first come in and do it as a part of the normal intake process. And then we also, if someone expresses concerns about uncomfortability, we always try to do our best to help them relocate if they truly feel like they are not comfortable enough to stay in the same facility. And I think we're ready for the next slide. And okay, so going into just general housing recommendations. So this slide is a little bit more focused on if a program is trying to provide or develop their own in-house housing services, but it could also be utilized for providing guidance or advocacy for survivors getting into other housing programs. Obviously, I think the ideal would be to make sure that programs are providing male-specific shelters, or at least co-ed programs are starting to have increased popularity, and we've seen that in our Dallas area. Is that a lot of the shelters are either trying to move in that direction. It's also really important to utilize a housing first or low barrier to entry models, because a lot of male survivors have criminal history, substance abuse, no documentation. So just not requiring a lot of things up front, or not even trying to, assess for a lot of these things in terms of for them to be able to come into shelter or for them to be placed anywhere. And then, what we've seen is really the more choices you can offer, the better. Flexibility is key. And I keep talking about kind of building this toolbox of all the different options that are available within your community, so that you can kind of pull as you need, depending on your male survivors' housing needs and barriers and challenges. And, the way that we do that with with our survivors is we really kind of have a housing first kind of we have a housing solutions program that offers a lot of flexibility. We offer a lot of different options to try to piece together the best housing plan, from crisis to stability to, long-term care. So we have a variety of different options under like our emergency options. Under medium, we have like transitional housing, rapid rehousing. Long-term, we have just rent assistance. So we really try to build a program that was going to be really flexible to each male survivor's needs and where they're at. And it's also really important to kind of think through things that are other than just the actual housing. I apologize. I had to step away for a second, but it's also really important to think through some of the other essential items that a survivor is going to need while they're, while they're receiving housing, and thinking through, like, if you are going to be providing financial assistance costs, like really thinking through not just rental assistance, but what are the other housing costs that they might need assistance with. And when we're talking about essential items, thinking through making sure that as you are, asking for donations, or thinking through, getting food and toiletries and clothing, that you're really taking consideration like gender neutral items, especially in terms of like color and smells, and thinking through items that might be very specifically needed by males, whether that's like certain types of razors or underwear and things like that. So then we know that this is probably not always possible, but obviously, it can be helpful if the staff is from the same gender or cultural background as the male survivors. So that's just something to take in consideration, especially if you're working with a lot of male survivors. And then the last piece is always just, making sure that you're looking at your policies and making sure that they are trauma informed, that they're survivor centered, and that they're survivor informed. Okay, next slide. And I don't want to take all the time because I know Raphael still needs to speak, but just wanted to quickly kind of go over one of the most flexible models that we use at Mosaic, which is the scatter site housing model. And basically the idea of that is that, a survivor would ideally be able to pick their own location, their own apartment, and the lease would ideally be in their name, or the lease could be in the agency's name. So having that flexibility is really important because, for some survivors, it would make more sense for the lease to be in their name, but for other survivors, they might have a harder time being able to get a lease due to rental history, criminal history, credit scores, things like that. So having that flexibility. And then the program itself would provide the rental assistance directly in direct payments to the landlord or the housing company. And honestly, the benefits, we think, it just offers a lot of flexibility. Oftentimes the way it works for us is that, we provide this through transitional housing, or we provide it through rapid rehousing. And then after their transitional housing period is over, or after the rapid rehousing period is over, they oftentimes can stay in that apartment and continue to renew the lease for themselves and cover the cost. And then it allows the client to kind of build credit. Although, again, if the agency's name is on the lease, it really doesn't allow for that. And then the last piece is it really just does allow for survivors to live independently and to have more choice and more options. So, and then next slide. And just the last thing I wanted to mention about, thinking through about sustainable housing, because oftentimes with a lot of the work, the nature of the work we do, we're really focused on crisis, stabilization, trying to address immediate needs. And so I think, when you're looking at the entire progression of working with a survivor, trying to look at, all of their housing needs at different points in time, again, from crisis to stability to getting to the point of being thriving and self-sufficiency. And so really being and this sustainable housing should be a conversation that's constantly happening from the very first intake, and then, regularly assessed all the way throughout the entire duration of when they're going to be in your program. And so that includes like thinking through the long-term housing options and thinking through comprehensive services that need to be provided at the same time as the housing, such as the case management, the counseling, the legal, the economic empowerment. For our experience, what we have seen, especially lately, is that the housing and the economic empowerment kind of go completely hand in hand, and it's often challenging to do either one without each other. And the last piece I'm just going to mention is it's really important to think through like the sustainability planning for a survivor, a male survivor with housing, making sure that this is not a one-time conversation, or at the end of their services, you're just meeting with them one last time to have a discussion. You're really taking, the months or the several appointments that it really takes to really think through, sustainability planning in the long term after they are finished receiving your services, such as like affordability, budgeting, money management, and that they have a support system in place to be able to continue to stay in housing. And then I guess I could turn it back over to Raphael.
Yeah, thank you, Celine. So we're just gonna skip back, go back, rewind to the to Raphael's slide. So there we go at Real Life Impact. Take it away, Raphael.
Hi everyone. Is everybody able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna compare. I'm gonna share a little case study, Jose's case, with my experience, and then we're gonna compare at the end what the outcomes and how beneficial it is to do the right thing. So next slide, please. Jose is in his late 20s. He moved from Mexico. When he arrived to the United States, he performed different jobs to provide for his loved ones in Mexico. As you know, the minimum wages in Mexico is like $2 or $3, and when you get here and you start making probably $5 or $10 a week, you're still being exploited or trafficked, but you don't know the difference because of the cultural issue. Jose was offered a job in a ranch where he was forced to commit several illegal activities for the drug cartel. Eventually, the house was raided. Yes.
So sorry for interrupting, but can you just move a little away from your mic? The audio is just like very rough on our end.
Way like more. Sorry, I'm on my cell phone. I don't know how to move it. Is that better?
A little back.
Hold on, let me see. I'm
moving away from the speaker.
Hear me better?
Yep.
Eventually, the house was raided by the police and Jose was taken into custody. Can we move to the next slide, please? An officer noticed the signs of physical abuse. Jose explained that he was forced to work and participated in illegal activities. He was offered services in exchange for agreeing to testify in court. After testifying in court, he was dropped off at a homeless shelter and never contacted again. After many years, Jose was identified as a survivor of human trafficking and received services from different organizations. Jose is now over 55 years old and is still struggling with housing. It's so hard for him to get a job. This is a person that I know, and he struggles a lot with housing because he's 55. He never got any services, and he was actually used and probably exploited by the system. Now, in my case, in my experience, when I was identified as a survivor of labor trafficking, I was placed in a hotel, a safe hotel, not a motel where illegal activity or triggers can be happening. I was placed in a hotel, exactly how the co-facilitator explained it earlier, and I was there for a few days. After a while, I was offered to move with the mother of my son, or very well known, the love of my life, also known as my ex. So I moved in with her for a short period of time in a small apartment, and I got something that changed my life. I got a hold of my son. And my son was my motivation. If you guys have kids, you would know that your kid is everything, and I was inspired, and I got hope, and I started feeling the love again, and I know I wasn't a worthless, useless human being who was just used for work and labor and exploited, and someone's personal slave. But now I got the hope to continue moving forward and do better things in life. During the temporary housing in that small apartment, I remember struggling a lot to being outside, and I was insulated. For some time, we lived a little far from a park, so then we find a second apartment, a little bigger, cleaner, and that was a park. And I was able to take my son to the park and come out of the insulation just because I got a stable housing. If I would have been placed in a shelter like Jose, I have no doubt that I would have lost custody of my son, and I probably won't be here today. So what happened when you use a stable housing and the proper housing for males, especially because of the cultural issues that we have? Men don't cry, men provides, men blah, blah, blah. We know those are just cultural mythics because that's not real. It hurts the same. And we do cry, and we do have a lot of feelings and emotions also. So because I was placed in a momentary, like, short-term housing hotel, then a small apartment, we moved to a bigger apartment closer to the park, better community, a better place. I've been able to do many things. For example, I have a stable job today. I have custody of my son. I have developed a career. And the most important thing, I'm here today, being able to share what happened with me. But because someone took the time to take training and put males in the proper placing, finding his needs, or the male needs, it will help him restore his personality and being able to really find himself like I did. And it was because I was placed, timing at the right place, the hotel, small apartment, medium apartment. And I can share with you today that I helped the mother of my son to buy a house. So she owns a house now. I'm not proud of it, which is sad, but I was helpful. And it was just because someone put me in the right place. What else do I have to share with you? Okay. When you find someone like they did with me to move me with a family member, with someone that I know, many things happen at the time. For example, reintegrated with my family. I really tried to work out things to have my family restored. We couldn't do it. It's okay. We move forward. But I did have the opportunity just because of the housing and the proper placing at timings. Okay. Do you guys have any questions for me at this time? Evanita or Karen?
All right, thank you, Rafael. The sound is still a little bit muffled, but I think we were able to hear. There is one question that we received prior to the webinar, and maybe Rafael, you can answer this. Are there any tips to counter gender bias against male survivors?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? It's cutting off. I'm so sorry.
Sure. No problem. The question was, are there tips to counter gender bias against male survivors?
Oh, that's tough. It's always going to be biased because of the cultural issues. It's really knowing that everything that hurts a female, it will hurt a male. And putting on the side all the stereotyping and really focusing on what he needs at the time and being okay with him crying or with him having a breakdown. Even wearing a pink shirt, many times they start, stereotyping and start seeing more, is he LGBTQ? Is he representing another gender? And I think that's wrong because many men like to wear pink, like I do. So putting aside all those cultural issues and barriers and acknowledging when the person is crying, being sensitive, being realistic that men do cry and they do feel pain the same way you ladies do. So I don't know if that answered your question.
I definitely think it does. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering that. So not to jump to assumptions about somebody's gender identity, you know, if they have a more emotional response to something. So if they're triggered, not to jump to conclusions. That's a great piece of advice. We also had another question about, so can you provide recommendations, and I think this is for Solan, for organizations that want to expand their housing programs from working with only females to be more male inclusive?
I think, I guess all of the things that we had already kind of talked about. I think, the key, what I often find is really needing to think through funding, how you're going to do that, like in terms of capacity and also in terms of thinking through. So there's like the funding piece, in my opinion, and then there's also thinking through programmatically, like developing policies and procedures or updating your policies and procedures. And I think the other recommendation I would have is really thinking through, getting some feedback from male survivors themselves. We keep talking about being survivor informed, and I know that not everyone has easy access to that. So I think the ultimate answer I'm going to probably say is that if you're considering that, to obviously contact the Freedom Network Training Institute Housing Project, and they can kind of provide further guidance on technical assistance. They can connect you with other organizations that have this experience, for example, maybe like Mosaic or other opportunities. So I think in being able to check out the wealth of information that has already been provided, I think it is important to talk about, biases and be aware of, perceptions and be aware of, things that you should take in consideration when trying to serve any new population or trying to expand services. But at the end of the day, I guess my recommendation is just thinking of them as a human being rather than as a male or female survivor. And thinking about how you can realistically adjust, like kind of doing an assessment of your current policies, procedures, funding, how you're designing your program to serve survivors, and thinking through like where are the places where you might be lacking, and then just kind of reaching out to the appropriate, like I said, the Freedom Network Training Institute, provide further guidance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think we had another question that maybe ties into this earlier today, and it was coming from Carrie. Sorry, Carrie, not to call you out, but it was in regards to screening tools. So I'm assuming that you are referring to screening tools as far as how to identify victims of labor trafficking or male survivors human trafficking. And once again, just to draw your attention to Freedom Network website, and to email us for additional assistance. But I think you also had a question as far as satisfaction surveys. And I will say that if you are receiving OVC funding, there is a mandatory action research requirement. So you, as a result of that, you may have a third-party evaluator that can assist you in drafting a survey that could be used with the population that you are serving. I know that within my organization, our evaluator is also a psychologist, and he ensures that any question asked is asked in the right way. And that is IRB approved. And we make sure, if we're talking about satisfaction, to have actually somebody else ask those questions so that there's no bias when we are getting the feedback from the survivors about our services. I hope that was the question and that was the answer. So next question that we received prior to the webinar as well is, how do we prepare and educate males entering structure, considering societal norms that create barriers and or shaming of males in these vulnerable situations? That was a long question. So how do we, I'm assuming this asks, how would we assist survivors in entering a housing unit that is more structured? How would they take that information coming from a service provider? How do we frame it?
I'm sorry, Maya, I don't know if I understand the question. I don't know if you could repeat it again, or I just want to make sure.
Sure. So this was, I think, for Rafael. Okay. How do we and educate males entering structure, considering societal norms? So the way that I'm interpreting it is that, how do we prepare males for, I guess, entering transitional housing or, shelter housing? How do we prepare for that change? How do we educate them on, I guess, being a good tenant? That's the one way that I would take that question.
Naja, I think being very, very transparent and honest, being upfront with rules and regulations, what's allowing, what's not, will be very helpful. Also, like I mentioned, and I'm going to repeat myself on that, knowing the needs of the survivor. Many times, we believe that that's the option that we have, and that's all we want to put into it. But we have to sometimes redefine success. Is that going to be a successful place for him? Is he going to be shamed or shy because there is no more survivors of human trafficking, or there is survivors but not of labor trafficking, or no firm that look like me, that speak my language if there's a language barrier? Am I going to have also a big communication barrier with the rest of the community because we are very different culturally speaking? Knowing, and you can tell also by age, many survivors are more hardcore, old school, like Jose. I don't think Jose will do good in any sharing a space with more people because he's more, he tends to get irritated very fast because of his age. So there are so many facts that we have to take into consideration at this time. But honest, I believe that just by being upfront and very transparent with survivors and the place that they're going to be, the time that they have, and keep reminding them, if they only have 90 days, tell them you got 60 days, this is the last 30, we need to find out another option. Is there anything else that we have to think? If he's still enrolled in your program, if he's not and he's out of luck, probably providing the proper support without pushing him to make decisions. You don't have to make decisions for him. You have to help him to make the best decisions for him to be restored in a positive way.
Thank you so much, Rafael, for answering that question. So transparency and honesty is key, is what I gathered from that answer. We had one more question come before the webinar. Just want to remind everybody, if there was something that was not answered during this webinar, or you expected something else, please type in your questions. We have about 20 more minutes. We'll do our best to cover the topic or give you answers. But going back to a question that we received prior to the webinar is, are you seeing options for young minor male survivors, best practices for young men as well as adults? Solan, I'm going to pass it back to you on that one.
I would, I guess, I think, working with male survivors, I'm just going to emphasize like the flexibility. So like as Rafael has mentioned in his story, I think what we often see is that that because the existing and current structures that exist that might, male survivors might try to access, aren't really tailored or catered or available, are not usually available to male survivors. What we found is really that we need to be flexible and that we have to have a trauma-informed care approach. We need to be able to make sure that we are providing, tailored services and taking the male survivors' needs into consideration, taking all of the stigma, the bias, what they're feeling and what they're going through into consideration. So I think really thinking through those pieces would be very helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that actually addresses most of the questions, or if not all of the questions that we received prior to the webinar. Is there anything else that our participants would like to ask at this time? No? I think we have somebody typing. Give it a second. All right. So I just want to, if we can move to the next slide, please. So just want to refer back to some of the resources the Freedom Network already has in place. Please visit our website, www.freedomnetworkusa.org, and you will find our resource library with some of the past webinars, as well as fact sheets developed for both housing providers that are interested in now serving survivors of human trafficking, as well as for victim services organizations on how to collaborate with some of the other fields that are in fact providing housing. We're also able to provide technical assistance, so please email us as training@freedomnetworkusa.org. Oh, we are missing one question. Okay, we have one question that came up. What is more common, labor trafficking or sex trafficking in males? So I'm not sure if we could answer this, because human trafficking is so very much underreported, especially within the male population. As you can imagine, there is a lot of stigma associated with somebody coming forward and saying that, they are a victim of sex trafficking, with all the gender norms and the media and the way that, I think the society expects males to act. So really would not be able to tell you, whether there's more sex trafficking or labor trafficking. I will say that in my experience working in the state of Georgia, a male survivor of human trafficking is much more likely to disclose that, there was a situation of labor trafficking than sex trafficking occurring. Okay. So let me see if we're missing any more questions. All right. Okay. So if that is it for the questions, if we can go ahead and take a few minutes to complete the survey, there will be a link shared in a minute or so. So please take our survey. Let us know if this webinar is what you initially expected. The survey is in the chat box, shared with everybody. It's through SurveyMonkey. So please be honest and let us know if there's something that we're missing, if something you're excited about trying out in your state, in your city, and we would be more than happy to provide that technical assistance moving forward. So you can take some of these tools and some of the things that you learned during today's webinar and apply it to the work that you're doing within your agency. So thank you so much.